The wind howled through the dense trees, bending the tall pines like brittle reeds in the unforgiving wilderness. The world seemed to pulse with a rhythm known only to the wild, an ancient, untamed beat that David had grown accustomed to over the years. As a seasoned wildlife researcher, he had spent countless hours traversing these rugged terrains, documenting the behavior of bears, wolves, and countless other creatures in their natural habitat. The harshness of the Alaskan wilderness no longer fazed him. It had become a backdrop to his life's work. Yet, today was different. David had been deep in the forest, the trees towering like silent sentinels around him, when a faint cry pierced the air. It was a low, pained sound, so unlike the usual growls and grunts of the wild. David froze. His instincts kicked in, sharpening every sense. He knew that this wasn't the sound of any animal he had been studying. It was the cry of something in distress, something vulnerable. He followed the sound cautiously, moving quickly through the underbrush, the rough terrain cutting at his legs. As he pushed through a thick cluster of trees, he saw it. A bear, young but large, its fur matted with blood, its body crumpled and weak. The bear's eyes, wild with pain and fear, met David's, and for a split second, the world around them seemed to disappear. In that moment, everything he knew about the wild, the harsh survivalist world he had studied so intently, was shattered. David had seen his fair share of injured animals, but never one like this. The bear's injury was severe. Its leg twisted at an unnatural angle, a deep gash across its side. It was clear that the animal was in agony, and yet there was something more in its gaze, a flicker of trust, of desperation, that struck David to his core. He knew what he had to do. The wilderness might have been indifferent to suffering, but David wasn't. He wasn't just a researcher in that moment. He was a lifeline. With no time to lose, David made the call that would change everything. He would carry the injured bear, hours away from the nearest vet, and what would unfold over the course of the next few hours would defy everything he thought he understood about the natural world. The pain was unbearable, but the bear's spirit, though battered, was far from broken. David felt its labored breaths against his chest as he hoisted the creature into his arms, its massive frame heavy, but not yet lifeless. He could feel the bear's body tremble. Each step David took carrying them both closer to the nearest clinic, where a veterinarian might have a chance to save the animal's life. But as they journeyed through the rugged terrain, inching towards safety, David began to sense something that didn't belong in the world he had studied for so many years. For as long as he could remember, David had believed that nature operated on the principle of survival of the fittest. Animals, particularly predators like bears, wolves, and lions, were thought to be driven purely by instinct, ruled by the law of the wild, where kindness, empathy, and cooperation were luxuries reserved for only the most rare and exceptional circumstances. But what was happening now defied every principle he'd ever been taught. As he trudged through the snow, keeping the injured bear close to his chest for warmth, something strange happened. Despite its own injuries and the pain that must have been consuming it, the bear began to exhibit a behavior that David had never seen in such a creature. The bear's sharp, intelligent eyes, once filled with fear and desperation, had softened, and for reasons David couldn't quite comprehend, the animal began to move closer to him. Its massive paw, despite being broken and raw, gently brushed against David's leg, almost as if seeking comfort. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't a survival tactic. It was something far different, something human, even. David's heart skipped a beat as he carefully adjusted his hold on the bear, moving slowly to avoid causing it more distress. It was as if the bear, though incapable of understanding the human world, had formed some kind of bond with him. This wasn't a wild creature acting out of fear or instinct. This was a creature that seemed to recognize David, not as an intruder, but as an ally. David paused, unsure of how to react. He had heard reports of rare, almost mythical moments where animals like bears demonstrated extraordinary behaviors, but he had always dismissed them as outliers, anecdotes that didn't quite fit into the scientific narrative. Yet, as he stood there, with the bear's warm breath mixing with his own, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing something far more significant than a mere anomaly. It was during their brief rest in a small hollow, as the day began to wane and the cold seeped into their bones, that David saw it more clearly. The bear, with great effort, began to shift its weight, using its uninjured front paw to nudge a nearby rock. At first, David thought it was an attempt to move, to make itself more comfortable, but as he watched closely, he realized the bear was pushing the stone toward him, like an offering. It was an impossible thought. The bear was offering him help. It was not merely reacting out of the need to survive, not just trying to get through the pain, but was showing some form of reciprocity, something that defied his understanding of the natural world. How could an animal so large, so fearsome, behave in this way? David's thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Could the bear be capable of empathy? Could this creature, known for its solitary and often brutal existence, have the ability to feel or understand anything beyond survival? The idea seemed absurd, yet the evidence in front of him was undeniable. The bear wasn't just seeking help. It was actively engaging in a form of interaction that David had never witnessed in a predator before. Its instincts, those survival-driven impulses that govern the wild, had been supplanted, it seemed, by something deeper, something more profound. David felt the weight of the moment settle on him. He had been prepared for the rawness of the wilderness. He had been trained to study it, to understand the behavior of animals as they fought, struggled, and adapted. But this was different. The predator in his arms wasn't acting out of mere survival. It was showing signs of something far more complex, something that his years of study couldn't explain. As they continued their journey, David's mind raced with possibilities. Was this behavior indicative of an unspoken intelligence, a consciousness in animals he had failed to recognize before? Could there be, hidden beneath the veneer of aggression and predation, a capacity for kindness, for connection? And if this was true, how many other creatures in the wild were capable of similar acts, of cooperation, empathy, or even altruism? The questions hung heavy in the cold air, but one thing was certain. David's understanding of the animal kingdom, of the raw, instinctual world he had spent so much of his life studying, had been irreversibly transformed. This bear, this injured, once ferocious creature, had opened a door to a new reality, one where empathy, not just survival, was a force that could guide even the wildest creatures. What had begun as a simple act of rescue, an effort to save an animal in distress, had blossomed into a discovery that would challenge everything David had ever known. And in that moment, as he carried the bear through the wilderness, the world seemed to open up before him, wide, untamed, and filled with possibilities that science had yet to fully understand. As the hours stretched on, David's arms ached, the weight of the bear's body growing more pronounced with each step. The snow crunched beneath his boots, a constant rhythm that matched the pounding of his heart. The air was frigid, the sharp wind biting through his clothes, but David barely noticed it. He was hyper-aware of the bear's labored breathing against his chest, the heat of its body melding with his own. The bear's rough fur brushed against his face occasionally, its scent, a mix of earth, pine, and something deeper, something raw, lingering in the cold air. The wilderness had a way of getting into everything, of leaving traces that were as much a part of the landscape as the snow and the trees. But it wasn't the cold or the exhaustion that filled David's senses now. It was the quiet, the strange stillness between them. The silence of the forest was profound, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the bear's breath and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. As they moved deeper into the wilderness, the trees seemed to grow denser, more oppressive, their shadows stretching long across the ground. David could feel the weight of the forest pressing in, but it was not the oppressive weight of nature's indifference. It felt more like a presence, a witness to the moment unfolding. At first, he had dismissed the bear's unusual behavior as a fluke, a moment of panic, perhaps a survival instinct kicking in as the animal sought comfort in its suffering. But as they continued their journey, David could not ignore the growing sense that something far more profound was happening. With each step, the bear's body seemed to relax, its head resting more comfortably against David's shoulder, its injured paw lightly brushing his leg every few moments. David had never seen anything like it. Bears were solitary creatures by nature, fierce protectors of their territory, and rarely interacted with others outside of their own species. They weren't known for seeking help from humans, let alone offering any form of comfort. And yet, here he was, carrying an injured bear through the wilderness, and the creature was responding to him as though it recognized something in him, something beyond the simple need for assistance. David's mind spun, trying to reconcile what he was witnessing with everything he had ever been taught. The harsh, unforgiving world of the wild he knew had no place for empathy. Survival was the law. It had to be. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more he realized how absurd that idea was in the face of what was happening. The bear wasn't merely a creature of instinct. It was something more, something that defied his understanding. He looked down at the bear's face, its eyes now half closed, but still watching him with that strange, unspoken connection. There was no aggression in its gaze, no fear or distrust, only a quiet, unspoken bond that seemed to transcend their differences. The bear was not just seeking help. It was offering something in return, something that David had never expected from a wild animal. In a way, it was as if the creature had acknowledged something within him, a kind of empathy that seemed to transcend species boundaries. David felt his heart tighten in his chest. He had always thought of himself as an observer, a detached researcher who studied animals from a distance, analyzing their behavior with cold precision. But now, as he carried the bear through the wilderness, he felt something shift within him. This wasn't just about data or research. It was personal. He had never been so close to an animal in such a raw, vulnerable way. The bear's pain was his pain now, its struggle his struggle. They were no longer two separate beings. They had become something more, bound together by an unspoken understanding that defied reason. A wave of confusion washed over David. Was he projecting human emotions onto this animal? Was he reading too much into the bear's actions, interpreting them through a lens of human empathy? And yet, the connection between them felt too real, too raw, to dismiss. He had seen enough of animal behavior to know when something was instinctual, when it was merely driven by the need for survival. This wasn't that. This was different. The bear wasn't just reacting to pain or fear. It was engaging with him in a way that suggested awareness, understanding, and something akin to trust. David swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. What did this mean? What was he supposed to do with this knowledge? He had spent his entire career studying animals, observing their behavior from the safe distance of his research. He had categorized them, analyzed them, but never had he felt such a deep, visceral connection to one of them. He had always seen himself as an outsider in the wilderness, a human in a world that didn't belong to him. But now, as he carried the bear, this majestic, powerful creature, he felt something stir inside him. Maybe for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be a part of the natural world, not just an observer. The weight of the bear's body against his own, its warmth seeping into him, became a physical reminder of that connection. It was as if the animal's pain, its struggle, had woven itself into his own being. And for the first time, David understood the true cost of empathy. It wasn't just about helping another. It was about feeling their pain, sharing in their burden, and standing beside them in their moment of need. As the journey continued, the landscape around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, the man and the bear, moving through the snow-covered wilderness, bound together by something neither of them could fully explain. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable. It was a space filled with understanding, with the unspoken bond that had been forged between them. David had always believed that the wild was a place of struggle, of competition, of raw survival. But now, as he carried the bear, its life hanging in the balance, he realized that the wilderness was capable of far more than he had ever imagined. It was a place not just of conflict, but of connection, of shared moments of vulnerability and strength. And in that moment, David felt his perception of the world shift forever. The wild was not just a cold, indifferent place. It was a place where even the fiercest creatures could show a depth of emotion and connection that was beyond anything he had ever understood. By the time David reached the edge of the forest, his body was on the verge of collapse. His muscles screamed in protest, the weight of the injured bear more than he had ever anticipated. The bear, too, was fading. Its breathing had grown shallow, and the strength it had briefly displayed seemed to have evaporated, leaving it limp in his arms. The journey to the vet's clinic still felt impossibly far, and with each passing moment, David could feel the life slipping away from the animal. He glanced down at the bear, its large eyes still open but glazed with exhaustion. The animal's head rested on his shoulder, as if it had accepted its fate, but there was no panic, no thrashing against the inevitable. In those final moments, the bear had stopped fighting. It had ceased to struggle in a way that David couldn't comprehend. There was an eerie sense of surrender, but it was a surrender that felt like peace. For all the years David had spent studying the brutal realities of the wild, he never expected this quiet acceptance, this bond that seemed to transcend the harshness of nature. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more David realized that this wasn't just about the bear's survival. It was about something far more profound, something that reached into the very heart of the wild. As he continued to trudge forward, David thought about the animal's behavior. The gentle paw that had brushed his leg, the way it had nuzzled into him during their journey, the trust it had placed in him when it was at its most vulnerable. All the lessons he had learned in the wilderness, all the research he had conducted over the years, began to feel irrelevant. This bear had done something that contradicted everything he had believed about the natural world. It had demonstrated empathy, an awareness of something beyond mere survival. And in doing so, it had changed David. When they finally reached the makeshift vet's clinic, David barely had the strength to call out for help. His voice was hoarse, his hands trembling as he gently laid the bear on the ground. The veterinarian rushed over, shock and disbelief flashing across their face as they took in the sight of the massive creature, still breathing but barely conscious. The vet worked quickly, administering first aid, stabilizing the bear's wounds. But even as the team worked tirelessly, David couldn't tear his gaze away from the animal. The bear's chest rose and fell slowly, the rhythm of its breathing like a fragile thread that connected them in a way nothing else could. The more the vet worked, the more David felt a sense of awe settle deep in his chest. This was no longer just about the animal's physical survival. It was about something far deeper. This bear had taught him a lesson that no textbook, no study, no theory could have ever prepared him for. The bear's survival was uncertain. The vet wasn't sure if the animal would make it, but there was something unspoken in the air, a feeling of quiet hope. David stayed by its side, offering words of reassurance, though he wasn't sure if the bear could hear him. Yet, as the hours passed, something incredible happened. The bear, still weak but determined, lifted its head and turned its gaze to David. It was a look filled not with fear, but with something deeper, an acknowledgement. A bond had formed between them, one that transcended the boundaries of species. In that moment, David realized that the connection he had felt during their journey was not a figment of his imagination. The bear had known all along. It had known David was not just a rescuer. It had recognized a companion, someone who understood its vulnerability. The animal had opened itself up to trust, to seek comfort, not out of mere survival, but because it had recognized something in David. It wasn't just about instinct anymore. It was about a deeper understanding of empathy, of what it meant to care for another, to share a moment of pain and healing. As the bear's breathing began to stabilize, David's thoughts shifted. He had come into this situation as a researcher, as an observer of the wild. He had studied animals from a distance, analyzed them through a lens of logic and survival. But now, as he watched the bear fight for its life, as he saw it look at him with recognition and understanding, David understood that the true depth of the animal world was beyond logic. It was about connection. It was about recognizing the humanity in creatures that were once thought to be driven purely by instinct. The next few days were touch and go. The bear was critically injured, and the vet worked tirelessly, monitoring its condition. But as the bear began to show signs of recovery, something inside David shifted permanently. He was no longer just a researcher of the wild. He was a part of it, In the quiet moments by the bear's side, as the animal rested and regained strength, David realized that the wilderness was not just a place of survival. It was a place of shared experiences, where even the most fearsome creatures could offer something profound to those who were willing to listen. The bear made a slow but steady recovery, and over time, it grew stronger. But the true transformation was in David. He no longer viewed the wild as a cold, indifferent realm, but as a living, breathing world that existed in shades far beyond survival. He had witnessed a connection between species, a recognition of vulnerability and trust that opened his eyes to the emotional depth of the animal world. David's research began to take a new direction. He no longer sought just to observe, but to understand, to connect with the animals he studied on a deeper level. The wild had taught him that survival wasn't just about fangs and claws, but about the moments of tenderness, empathy, and connection that could emerge even in the most unlikely places. In the weeks following the bear's rescue, David found himself at a crossroads. The incident, once a simple act of animal rescue, had spiraled into something far more complex, something that challenged the very foundations of his understanding of animal behavior. The bear's actions, its empathy, trust, and quiet recognition, had shattered the walls of scientific rigidity he had built around himself. His research, his career, his worldview had all been grounded in the belief that animals were driven by instincts, by hardwired behaviors that prioritized survival above all else. Yet what he had witnessed defied every established theory. David had spent years studying the natural world, meticulously cataloging behavior, observing the laws of the wild from a safe, academic distance. He had always known that animals were capable of complex behaviors, communication, social bonding, even problem-solving in some species. But empathy, trust, and compassion? These were traits David had always reserved for humans, not the cold, instinct-driven creatures of the wilderness. What he had seen with the bear had made him question everything. Could animals, even the most solitary and feared predators, experience emotions that mirrored those of humans? Was it possible that animals had a sense of connection and empathy beyond the realm of survival? It was an idea that seemed radical, almost heretical, within the scientific community. But as David pored over his notes, as he revisited the bear's actions and behaviors, a new possibility began to take shape. What if the distinctions we drew between humans and animals, intelligence, empathy, consciousness, were not as clear-cut as they seemed? What if animals were capable of emotions and connections that had been overlooked or dismissed by science simply because they were too difficult to measure or understand? The more David thought about it, the more he realized that his own research had been limited by the assumptions he had always held. He had viewed animals through a scientific lens, one that focused on observable behaviors and quantifiable data. He had never fully explored the emotional or cognitive dimensions of their lives. But now, with the memory of the bear's trust and vulnerability still fresh in his mind, he couldn't ignore the fact that these creatures might be more aware, more complex than science had ever given them credit for. David's newfound perspective rippled out into his professional life. He began to question the methods and assumptions that had guided his career. Where once he had conducted experiments with an objective distance, he now found himself deeply invested in the emotional realities of the animals he studied. He started to look at his research subjects not just as data points, but as beings capable of forming connections, experiencing emotions, and understanding each other, and humans, on a level he had never considered before. As David began to share his findings with colleagues and the broader scientific community, he was met with skepticism. Many dismissed his theories as overly sentimental, pointing out the difficulty of scientifically quantifying emotions in animals. But there were also those who listened with an open mind, who recognized the potential for a shift in how animal behavior was understood. Slowly, the dialogue began to change. New research projects were launched, focused on exploring the emotional lives of animals, from the empathy observed in elephants to the cooperation found in wolves and primates. The idea that animals might have rich emotional lives, capable of understanding and even reciprocating the emotions of others, began to gain traction. In addition to his academic work, David became an advocate for a shift in how humans viewed their relationship with animals. He pushed for changes in conservation policies, advocating for a deeper understanding of animal behavior and decision-making. The emotional and cognitive capacities of animals, he argued, needed to be considered not only in research, but in how we protected and interacted with wildlife. He worked with conservation groups to incorporate this new understanding into their efforts, encouraging policies that prioritized empathy and mutual respect between humans and animals. On a personal level, the experience had transformed David's approach to life. The deep connection he had felt with the bear had ignited a profound change in his understanding of the world. He no longer viewed the wilderness as a place to study from a distance, but as a community, a living, breathing network of beings capable of emotions, relationships, and complexities that were far beyond the simple rules of survival. He had moved from being a detached observer to an active participant in the lives of the animals he studied, and that shift had given his work a deeper sense of purpose. David's career took on a new direction as he began to push the boundaries of animal behavior research. He no longer confined himself to the old paradigms of scientific observation. Instead, he sought to understand the emotional depth of the creatures he studied, believing that empathy and connection were as vital to the survival of species as instinct and adaptation. He became a vocal advocate for animal rights, not just in terms of physical preservation, but for the recognition of animals as sentient beings capable of experiencing joy, sorrow, and everything in between. In many ways, David's professional life had been built on the assumption that animals were something to be studied, categorized, and understood from a distance. But now, he had come to see them as partners in the broader ecosystem, a partnership that required understanding, respect, and care. He had once believed that science was about detachment, objectivity, and data. But the bear had shown him that sometimes, to truly understand the world, you had to be willing to engage with it on a deeper, more emotional level. As the years passed, David's perspective on the natural world continued to evolve, shaped by the profound experience he had shared with the bear. What had started as a simple act of compassion, carrying an injured animal to safety, had transformed into something far greater. The bond he had formed with that bear, a creature once thought of as a cold, solitary predator, had shattered his preconceived notions and led him to see the world through a lens of connection rather than separation. The field of animal behavior research was not the same after David's shift in perspective. His work, once rooted in the belief that animals were driven purely by instinct, now explored the complex emotional lives of animals, how they empathized, bonded, and navigated the world with a depth of consciousness he had never imagined. David's studies sparked new conversations in the scientific community about the emotional intelligence of animals, prompting others to explore what had long been dismissed or overlooked. That empathy, cooperation, and even a sense of moral understanding could exist in species far beyond humans. David's work in conservation also underwent a profound transformation. He began advocating for policies that not only prioritized the survival of endangered species, but also acknowledged the emotional and cognitive complexities of animals. He championed initiatives that emphasized animal welfare, insisting that animals be treated with respect, not just for their role in the ecosystem, but for their inherent value as sentient beings. His efforts helped to shift the tide in conservation, moving it from a purely utilitarian approach to one that recognized the emotional depth of the creatures being protected. But the most significant change was in the way humans began to view their relationship with nature. David's research and public speaking engagements began to spark a broader cultural shift, one that saw animals as more than just passive participants in the natural world, but as active, sentient beings with emotions and experiences. People began to see themselves not as separate from nature, but as a part of it, a realization that brought with it a newfound sense of responsibility. David would never forget the look in the bear's eyes, the quiet trust, the recognition, the unspoken bond that had transcended species. That moment had changed him forever. It had taught him that the wilderness was not a place to observe from a distance, but a place to engage with, to understand, and to protect. The wild was not an enemy to be conquered, but a partner to be respected. As he stood in the heart of the forest one last time, David felt a deep sense of peace. The bear's recovery had marked a turning point not just in his career, but in his life. It had led him to a place where science and empathy could coexist, where the boundaries between humans and animals were no longer defined by fear or detachment, but by mutual respect and understanding. The world was changing. More people were beginning to recognize the truth he had discovered, that we are all part of the same intricate web of life, and that the bonds we share with the creatures of the earth are far more profound than we could have ever imagined. David's journey had not just been about saving a bear. It had been about saving something far greater: our collective ability to connect, to understand, and to protect the world around us. And in the process, he had rediscovered the most important lesson of all, that the wild in all its untamed beauty was not a place to conquer, but a place to learn from.